Good morning, good afternoon, or evening, depending on where you are, and welcome if you have just joined us. I am Julia Joja, Director and Senior Fellow of the Frontier Europe Initiative of the Middle East Institute. And it is my pleasure to welcome you to today's event and panel on revolutions and wars in the Black Sea region, focusing on Ukraine and Georgia. MEI's Frontier Europe Initiative explores interactions between the Middle Eastern countries and their Frontier Europe neighbors, the parts of Central and Eastern Europe, Central Asia, and the Caucasus that form a frontier between Western Europe, Russia, and the Middle East. The program examines the growing energy, trade, and security and political relationships with the aim of developing a greater understanding of the interplay between these strategically important regions. Russia responded in the 21st century to the color revolutions, calling for freedom and democracy in Georgia and Ukraine by invading both countries in 2008, 2014, and 2022. Those revolutions and invasions have had transformative effects on the social and political fabric of both countries. Thus, the perspectives of today's youth on wars and political upheaval will have ample impact on their country's future. This panel discussion will bring together two of our Frontier Europe Initiative 2022 fellows to speak on these topics based on the research that they have conducted in the region. Specifically, the fellows will present their research findings pertaining to Ukrainian youth perspectives on Russia's full-scale invasion of their country this year, as well as the legacies of the Rose Revolution on Georgian politics and on Georgian society. The Frontier Europe Initiative 2022 research fellowships are granted by the United States State Department for the Middle East Institute's Frontier Europe Initiative program. I'm thrilled today to be joined by Gianna Piroli and Alison Hart to be talking about Ukraine and respectively Georgia. You have both been recently to the region to the extent that you were able to go to the countries and have talked to young people about the legacies of revolutions as well as the legacies of war and the impact of that on their lives and their families. To read our fellows' full bios, please join and visit the MEI website and the webpage of this event. I look forward to taking audience questions through Zoom's Q&A feature, which you can all find on your screens. And for those of you calling in by phone or watching our panel on the live stream on YouTube, you can ask a question by emailing events@mei.edu or tweeting us at MEI. If you have any technical issues, please use the same email, events@mei.edu, and my colleagues will be more than happy to help. And so before we get into the various questions that I have, and I'm sure the audience has too, with regards to the research you have conducted, I want to ask you to just give us an overview of the time that you spent researching both in country and outside of it. And perhaps we can start with you, Alison. You were able to actually go to Georgia to talk to young people about how they perceive the legacies of the Rosa Revolution in a very interesting time that overlapped with demonstrations and protests and with the sort of conditional EU candidate status that Georgia has received this summer from the European Union. So can you give us an overview of your main research findings as you were traveling to the region?
Yes, of course. And the fellowship, it was a great experience, and it was really great to get to work with you since March. And so the project that I focused on was Legacies of the Rose Revolution and how that impacts and has shaped domestic politics in Georgia today. I conducted around 40 interviews throughout my time in Georgia. I was there for 8 weeks between June and August and talked to people in many different fields, from academia to policy current politicians to former politicians, civil society members, amongst some others. And it was, when you think about the Rose Revolution, naturally people immediately think of the eradication of police corruption, because that was something that was so apparent and visible to people on a daily basis, that that's always the thing that people always mentioned in every one of the interviews that I did. But then when you go a bit deeper, you can see how the educational policies that were put in place starting in the late 1990s, but were changed more radically once they got rid of the corruption within the academic system, that allowed people to be educated. And now you have these people who are not only born in independent Georgia, but Georgia post Rose Revolution. And this has much more, people are more educated and able to have opportunity that they not necessarily would have prior. So this latent middle class that developed is something that I think needs a lot more research. And especially while I was there, as you mentioned, the EU decision, there were lots of protests. And the protests had over 120,000 people, which is the largest protest that Georgia has had since the Rose Revolution. And that is, a majority of those people are youth and people who see the opportunities that Europe could have and could bring them, and they very much want to be a part of that. And to them, in one of the conferences I attended as an attendee, not as a participant, they really emphasized the fact that they didn't think that the government was doing enough to be able to go to the EU, and they very much want that. They are working and continually work towards that. Although the protests have since died down after the decision, there is still that desire, and CRRC polls have it at over 80% of people wanting to join the EU. And if the government doesn't start to they have been taking it more seriously as time went on, but really take and move forward with it, I think people will become more frustrated.
That's an interesting take, and opens up a lot of questions in terms of parallels between the Rose Revolution then and what is happening now, also at a generational level. So I'd love to delve a little bit deeper into that. But before we do that, I want to turn to you, Gianna. Unfortunately, we were not able, due to the security situation, to send you to Ukraine, but nevertheless, we managed to send you to Poland, which is in real numbers the largest host of Ukrainian refugees, has been actually before 2022. And of course, that has taken a societal amplification, if you'd like, over the last few months as we've gotten into the war, which also means that you were able to meet with a lot of young people that are there studying different domains, and as I've learned from your research, have very complex and very well-informed and clear opinions about everything related to war, enemies, and friends. And so can you tell us a little bit more about what you have found talking to young Ukrainians in Poland, what your overall takeaways are from the research you have conducted in Poland?
Yes, thank you so much for having us. And while I wasn't able to travel to Ukraine, I still conducted the field research in Poland, like you mentioned. And I learned so much from these students. And I met with around 19 students, I believe, and young professionals in Poland, mostly in Warsaw, and then a few interviews back in Washington, D.C. with students in the D.C. area. And I learned so much from these students, and I was inspired mostly by the Euromaidan protests in 2013 and 2014 because of the influential role that students played in them and in society. So while I was in Poland, I met with these students. We talked about the public perception from Ukrainian youth on the US, NATO, and Russia. And students were from all different areas in Ukraine. Some were from the capital cities, some were from Lviv, Odessa. So it really contributed to a wide viewpoints. And there wasn't one uniform answer, I would say, in speaking with the students on these topics. There were common threads, of course, but there wasn't one one uniform response. And I think that shows how critically these students think about how war is impacting them and their identity, and what that looks like in the future for their country and for society. So I had three kind of main takeaways, I would say. So many, but three main ones is the first one. I would say students really critically think about these topics. And for example, I would say NATO, that was students had a variety of things to say about that. Overall, yes, young Ukrainians would like to see their country join NATO, but they do have their reservations, and I think that's valid. A few students mentioned, that NATO has more to learn from Ukraine than Ukraine does for NATO. But overall, yes, they would like to see their country join NATO in the future, for the security purposes and for the relationships with other countries in the alliance. And towards the US, I would say this was also something I wasn't expecting there to be such a focus on what the US is doing now versus how they responded in 2014. And I think that's something to take into account. Now students are pleased with how the US has responded. And they're happy with the support that they've received and the role that the US has played in gathering a unified response, mostly from the West. But in comparison to 2014, many noted that they didn't feel like the response from the US was adequate enough. And I think that it's an important point to note, because it's, yes, what the US has done, it's important, but it's what the US continues to do and how the US continues to support Ukraine. That's also important, and that leaves a lasting impression on these young students. The second point, something else that really stood out to me, is that these students are super passionate about these topics. They have a lot to say, and I think the US and the international community should really pay attention. They've only ever lived in an independent, democratic Ukraine, and they want to keep it that way. That's something that's really, really important to them. And a lot of the students, mostly, they all said, we are so proud to be Ukrainian, more so now after February 24th than ever before. And my last point, that something that really stood out to me, is that I think if the US wants to continue to build a strong relationship with Ukraine, it's really important to recognize how important the culture and the traditions, and especially the Ukrainian language, is to these students. They've been oppressed by Russia for so long, and their culture, their history, it's being attacked. And we see this with Russian soldiers going into Ukrainian libraries and burning books. This parallels what Nazi Germany did. The Nazis burned books that were considered un-German. So I think that if the US wants to continue to build a strong relationship with Ukraine, we have to keep these things in mind when we're interactions with Ukraine. So I learned a lot from the students, and I want to thank them for meeting with me, and for the universities in Warsaw that connected me to these students, despite everything going on.
Thank you. And as a quick follow-up question on that, you mentioned that you started your research, and you actually did your research proposal applying for this fellowship, obviously before the war, inspired by the revolution of the Dignity Revolution,
Yes.
or what we call Euromaidan. And that has been a moment in which public opinion in Ukraine has radically shifted, obviously, away from Russia. And then with young people that have been able to participate to some of an extent, for them 7-8 years is a much longer time than for someone beyond college at a different age. There are differences between what 2014 meant for the collective memory vis-a-vis Russia, particularly, and what 2022 meant. So following up on that, I know you asked them many questions regarding their views of Russia. It couldn't have been easy, neither for you nor for them. But building on that relationship between 2014 and now, the two moments, war and revolution, how do they think about Russia in this context? Has, for many of them, something radically shifted or for their family since 2022? Or was it something that they felt and was maybe just slightly deepened after 2022?
Yes, and that's a great question because I feel like the responses really truly varied. For some students, they said we before February 24th, we there were some good Russians, and after February 24th, their opinion, obviously for good reasons, drastically changed. And many of them said it's not Putin's war, it's Russia's war. And so I think that 2014, again, it was a different scenario. It was not the full scale invasion that we're seeing now, but students I think had a little bit more hope before February 24th in how they viewed Russia and Russians. I would say now many students said, you know, we are not listening to Russian music anymore. We're not speaking in Russian. We don't want to watch Russian movies. And that was something that since 2014, a few of them said, okay, well, you know, we enjoyed Russian music, but now we can't listen to it with a clear conscience. And I think, but for some, and again, it varied. For some, one student, a story that really stood out to me was that she was young and her grandmother went to put her to sleep, and she went to sing a lullaby in Russian. And the student, you know, a child at the time said, I won't fall asleep unless you sing this to me in Ukrainian. And so I think that February 24th was a defining moment for many. And looking towards the future too, many have said, we will never speak Russian again. And this isn't just something for our generation. This is something that I don't want my kids to speak Russian. I want my kids to speak Ukrainian. And so I think that also solidifies the role that young Ukrainians play in keeping the identity and the culture of Ukraine alive. But it certainly, I think, is something that the US and I don't think they'll relate to Russia well in the near future. Many said it's going to be generations and generations for us to ever relate to them, because we have been, again, oppressed for so long. One student, she showed me a picture of her house that was hit by a Russian missile. And she said, you know, not only was my physical bedroom destroyed, but all of these memories and childhood memories with my family, it's not the same anymore. So I think that's something that, again, the US and the international community should pay attention to, is the growing distrust and the growing dislike for Russia in the years to come.
And certainly the generational trauma too,
Yes.
right?
Yes.
Talking about revolutions and the legacies they leave, I want to turn to you, Allison, and ask you, in your understanding and based on the research that you've done, what the biggest difference was that you saw between generations and how they view the revolution in Georgia. You talk to young people, youth, just like Gianna. You also talk to people who, the revolution being now almost 20 years old in Georgia, have a clear memory of that. So looking across generations, what are the legacies that this revolution, the Rose Revolution, left on Georgia now?
I think when you look at Georgia, I mean, the past 30 years, the country has gone through so much. They've gone through independence, a civil war, a revolution, and a lot of the Georgians that I had talked to expressed the sentiment of Georgians are exhausted. You know, they've had so much change, and when talking to younger people, they still want more change. They're still hungry for a change, whereas the older generation seem a bit more apprehensive because they know change isn't always good. And some of the older generation, people of the older generation that I spoke with, have a tendency to maybe disregard the more hopeful, perhaps idealistic desire for change coming from the youth. But I think that is a trend that extends beyond Georgia as well. And looking back, the different generations, I think the late and middle class is very much a huge difference, because in the 2000s, before the revolution, when children had to go to school, it would be someone's day to bring the wood or the petrol to heat the classroom. There have been so many infrastructural changes that have drastically changed the lives, that what the historical memory of what parents and grandparents is vastly different than the younger generation born in independent Georgia, post-revolution Georgia. And I think the way that they interact and the future and possibility they see are largely impacted because of that. The younger people, especially with social media, seeing all the potential that could come from having further integration with Europe and the EU.
So then with these discrepancies among generations that seem to be pretty clear from your findings, how can we think about the revolution back then as impacting the newer generation? Do they think about it as something that should be replicated? And in that vein, looking at the movements that you have, the demonstrations that you have witnessed in Georgia in the context of EU candidate status and the wish of Georgians to join the European Union, what are the parallels that are there? Is that something that they're trying to replicate now? Are there the same sort of social and political conditions, or do you see them as completely disparate across generations movements?
I think I would be very careful in saying replicating anything, because that is a huge change. And I mean, in the US, as we know, when someone's storming Capitol, that does not necessarily mean there should be revolutionary change. And there's a lot of people who disagree with the way in which the revolution took place, and whether or not that change, especially when they weeded out the police corruption, should have been done over a long period of time or in one kind of swoop. And I think that the younger people, they want stronger democracy and institutions, and they don't necessarily, from my experience, want a revolution. And I had been a couple of times, people had said, due to America's obsession with Hamilton and revolution, that we are always looking for it in different places. And I thought that was very interesting, just as a general note, but also revolution can go very wrong sometimes. And although it was peaceful and the transition went well in 2003, I don't think anyone is really calling for that now by any means. But the parallels in the exhaustion and the desire for change, maybe at a more institutional level, in terms of going out and voting more, and they have upcoming elections. I think that will very much show the future that Georgians, especially young Georgians, want.
And then a last question in that vein, you talk in your research and draw some parallels, I guess, looking at revolutions like in America, like you mentioned, you're a researcher focused on revolutions and movements, not just in the Black Sea, but also in the Middle East. And so I guess Americans are looking for them. You're right. But then you talk in your research about the shame movement. And so can you talk us a little bit, for those who don't know, into what it actually, what it means in terms of a conceptual definition, but whether you think this has an impact on how people reflect on in Georgia in terms of social movements and generational change?
So the shame movement had been around since a little bit before, maybe a year or two prior to the war in Ukraine happening. And so it wasn't really a direct the ability to integrate into the EU so suddenly. But the shame movement was able to garner support, not necessarily because everyone was there to support the shame movement. Largely, most of the people weren't specifically there they had no clear-cut definition of what they were doing, besides they were at these protests because they wanted to join the EU, because they wanted the government to start following the steps in order to be able to integrate into it. And I think there was over 120,000 people that showed up, and that's a huge amount of people from all different generations. And although my Georgian is quite limited, when I went and walked by and was talking to people, you could see people of all different ages. And although politicians from both sides of the aisle were there, the movement chose to not have them speak, so that it wouldn't be so aligned with a political party, because the Rose Revolution started as a movement, and then into the UNM political party. So I think they want to be very clear that that's not what they're doing. They are a movement-oriented organization, though they haven't had as much protests since then. I think protests and similar like it and groups trying to integrate into the EU are going to continue to fight for that.
All right, thank you. Turning to you, Gianna, one of the questions we got from the audience is about your view on social media, and more importantly, what about these, how do young Ukrainians think about the role of social media in the war?
That's a great question, because it certainly came up actually a lot in the interviews that I held with students. It plays a huge role, I think, in shaping and informing young Ukrainians abroad. Many of the students I spoke with, like you had mentioned, are students in Poland. So for them, Instagram, Twitter, Telegram, they're great tools at informing the students and again, other members of the international community on what's happening and the atrocities of war. And President Zelensky has definitely utilized social media to inform the public on what's going on. In the same token, though, many expressed that because there is so much to report on and because social media is such a tool that many of them feel drained just almost with this responsibility. We have to share about what's happening in the war, and we log on to Instagram and there's just so much evil and to read about the genocide, it's mentally exhausting. And so a few students spoke about, we feel bad sharing what's happening in our lives, in Poland when there's so many people that are fighting and suffering in Ukraine. And how do you balance returning to normal content on social media while also sharing about what's happening in the war? And so I thought that was an interesting dichotomy that, yes, it is such a tool, but it also is a source of great pain because of, you can see pictures and videos and things that just, invoke such an emotion and such a response. And like you had mentioned earlier too, that trauma of war, it's evident in social media. And so it plays a huge role, I think, in shaping how Ukrainians abroad view what's happening, and also people in different countries as well.
So then with all these challenges, including with social media, I know from your research that you found that obviously Ukrainian youth has a very clearly defined, each one in their own way, thinking about what victory looks like. So can you tell us a little bit more about that, how Ukrainian youth thinks about victory and the prospects thereof, when, of course, it's too early to call, the situation is terribly difficult on the ground, but it's important to think ahead in positive terms, as we like to do here in the United States.
Well, and students are optimistic, and to them, there is no other option but a victory for Ukraine. However, what that means varied for each student. Some mentioned, and this, I would say this was actually a common thread amongst the interviewees, is that they do not want to see any more land. They want their land back. They will not give any more land than they've already, that's already being occupied. They want everything back. They are not willing to compromise on that. They don't want peace talks with Russia. Again, it's varied amongst the participant. One girl I spoke to, she said, I think that Russia should pay reparations and then leave. Let us rebuild our country, give us what we need, and then get out. And so they're optimistic. And like you said, it's hard to predict when will this end and how will this end, but to them, there's no other option but a victory for Ukraine. But also, on keeping that in mind, I would say they're also aware that there's a lot that the country, in terms of mental health, there's a lot that they will have to deal with, and many will will come out of this war, unfortunately, with PTSD and depression, as we've seen already. And so they're thinking about that too. How will this country deal with those types of things? Yes, the physical reconstruction of the country is important, but how are we going to deal with a country that's a generation that's so traumatized by the war?
So then in this context of thinking about victory, obviously the focus has been politically on President Zelensky. And so among Ukrainians in a healthy democratic society, there's obviously a range of how people are looking at him, though I think there is consensus that he remains the key political figure that has solidified support and solidarity across Ukraine and has been able to lead in these times of war. So how do Ukrainian young people think about Zelensky also in the context of before the war, his he in opinion polls was pretty low. He was not, he came as a political figure that many didn't know about, was new, was a big surprise, I think, to the international community. So 6-7 months now into the war, how do young Ukrainians think about Zelensky?
So I would say most of them weren't fans of him prior to the war, just because they felt like he didn't have the political experience that a leader should have. With that being said, a lot of them, most of them are pleased with how he has responded. Many of them cited President Biden giving Zelensky the option to leave, and he said, no, I'll stay with my country. And that moment, I think, for many young Ukrainians is what changed their opinion on him. And so
I need ammunition, not a ride,
yeah,
right?
yes. And I think that, again, it's the fact that we were able to have healthy conversations about what they liked about him and what they didn't like about him. That's the essence of a democracy. And a few even mentioned memes that have been going out online about Zelensky, and they said, you know, we in Ukraine, we can make memes of our president if we so choose, and that could never happen in Russia. So I think for them that solidified the fact that we're able to talk about these things, and we really value free speech, and we see this too in the Euromaidan protests. Many were upset with Yanukovych's response to a more pro-Russia and less European future. And so this isn't anything new for young Ukrainians, the emphasis and the value on free speech. But I think certainly with this war, we've seen it in opinions and responses to Zelensky.
And then turning to you, Allison, we talked about the legacies of the revolution, but there's certainly also the legacy of war, particularly in the context of the war in Ukraine. Georgians have the very recent and very traumatizing experience of Russian invasion in 2008. And that, of course, the more recent the invasion is, the higher the fears are. We see major fear vis-a-vis Russia, vis-a-vis an expansion of this war across the region in countries in the Black Sea region that have not had so recent of an experience with Russia and Russian aggression particularly. And so how does that feed into Georgian society right now? How do you see on one side the fear of war and war repetition when it happens in the neighborhood, and also how do you see Ukrainian refugees in Georgia? They've certainly been, you know, it's not in geographical terms the most intuitive. Many have made it, Ukrainian refugees, across the border after a very difficult path, unlike, you know, going directly to the west, to Poland, to Slovakia, to Romania, to Hungary. To make it to Georgia is a bit more difficult. And so how are they fitting into Georgian society, and how do fears of war fit into that?
Although I do think there are lots of fears of war because of the recent history, there's been an outpour of support for Ukraine. There are flags everywhere you go. Every Wi-Fi passcode at any cafe is Slava Ukraina, and everyone is very much in support. Some places you have to sign that you do not support the occupier just to go into. And I think, honestly, I did not encounter very many Ukrainian refugees as much as I did with Russians living in Tbilisi. And I think that is something that they are also dealing with, that dynamic of having more lenient visas, allowing for people to work in Georgia. Some of the Airbnbs aren't necessarily allowing Russians to live there. So there's that another layer of that. I think that largely everyone supports the the Ukrainians, and but at the same time there is like this fear in the background that it could happen there, that they are very apprehensive of.
Mm. And then finally, to sort of wrap up this conversation, Georgians also have a legitimate um, reason to feel resentful towards the West if we think about NATO particularly. It was in 2008 that membership for Ukraine and Georgia was promised but not palpable. And it was just a few months after that Russia launched the invasion of Georgia and occupied and still does illegally, obviously, 20% of its territory. So how do Georgians, in your understanding, feel about NATO and about essentially being left behind as even smaller country that in the wake of a second Russian invasion would not stand a chance, does not have the resources that Ukraine has? How do Georgians think about NATO in the West?
I think that from the people that I had spoken with, they are, like you said, quite resentful for not being able to be a part of NATO. But the focus mainly seems to be on the EU right now, and they largely want that over, I would say, anything. But the US is still largely involved in Georgia. There are so many projects in civil society that I think the connection between Georgia and the US is very strong on that level. But they would have preferred, I think, to have been in NATO a while ago versus now. That doesn't really seem to be something that the people that I were talking to is seen as the most pressing issue as of right now. They see the EU as having a different type of security reach as being a part of it.
And so if you are to think about the next few months and years, both of you, and focusing back on the United States, from military support to societal support and people-to-people contact, something that you've both done with your research, what would be the one thing that you, as the United States is looking towards a regional strategy, what would be the one thing that you would advise the United States to focus on as the most important thing for Georgia right now and for Ukraine? Allison, do you want to try first?
I think a continued relationship with civil society is very important. And I had read an article from the Belfer Center suggesting a military base in Georgia, which I thought was interesting, but I don't think there's as much call for that from the people that I was talking to. I didn't really talk to anyone in the military sector, so I wouldn't really know to that. But the youth that I talked to, mainly the EU is the biggest thing for them.
And Gianna?
I would say that I think the US should continue to, as its role in the West, I think it needs to really bring other countries together in a unified and to continue to show solidarity with Ukraine. I think the US has such a role in that, and what we do really influences how other countries respond. So I would say, looking forward, we can't forget that the war has been going on for months now, and it's the sooner that we continue to provide Ukraine with what they need, hopefully the war will end. Nobody wants to see this prolonged, and it's gone on for way too long. And so I think the US, its role in uniting the West, I think that's something that hopefully we'll continue to be able to do.
Thank you both so much for
Thank you.
for joining this panel and for the research you've presented and you've conducted. We look forward with Frontier Europe to continue to support you and continue to publish your work as well. And to our audience, many thanks for joining us, for the questions you've sent us, and for the interest you have in the Black Sea region, from society aspects to hard security and military support. And a big thank you also to our organizers for helping us put everything together. Without you, it wouldn't be possible. So until next time, continue to look for our activities with Frontier Europe Initiative. We always look forward to engaging with our audience and serving our audience with topics that are of interest